Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me for this segment, we have Ryan McCormack, Factor and Core Equity Strategist at Invesco, to discuss weekly performance in the Nasdaq-100 and year-over-year revenue growth in NVIDIA. It is great to see you as always, Ryan. And let's start right off with that. The weekly performance in the Nasdaq-100, certainly NVIDIA impacting that.
Yeah, it sure did. Great to see you too, Jill. Short week last week with only 4 trading days, but a good week for stocks ultimately. QQQM and QQQ up 1.44%. That underperformed the S&P 500 index's total return of 1.68%, was about even with the S&P 500 value index's 1.45% advance. Stocks started the week, on a somewhat lackluster note. We saw January CPI and PPI were reported higher than anticipated the week before, kind of stoking concerns around reaccelerating inflation. And then there was some uncertainty around NVIDIA's earnings report that took place on Wednesday afternoon after the close. We saw Nasdaq-100 and QQQM and QQQ trade lower on Tuesday and Wednesday to open the week. Then Wednesday, we saw the release of the FOMC minutes from the January 30th and 31st meeting. Tone seemed to be patience, right? Nothing too crazy outside of what we heard a few weeks ago from Chairman Powell, but ultimately patience in terms of not moving too quickly when it came to cutting rates, and that certainly seemed to hit home after last week's price gauges reports. But we heard in the previous release and commentary from Chairman Powell about watching the data, seeing some more sustainable movement in prices down towards the Fed's long-term 2% target. And then consistent with the Fed's message, the street isn't currently pricing in a rate cut for the March 20th meeting, only about a 1.3% chance. Expectations for a rate cut in May or from the May meeting have seemed to fall to about 16%. That's down from near 30% a week ago. So June seems to be now the meeting that the street is targeting with about a 53% expectation for a rate cut. And Thursday was the big mover. That was QQQM up nearly 3%, led by optimism following NVIDIA's earnings. It was the best day for either of those strategies or the Nasdaq-100 since last February. And then sort of in sympathy, we saw a lot of semiconductor and semiconductor-related stocks, among the best performers on Thursday's price action, with NVIDIA up over 16%, AMD up over 10.5%, Synopsys, Marvell Tech, and Broadcom all up over 6%.
All right. And Ryan, if we take a look at attribution in terms of what sectors contributed to the performance in the Nasdaq-100, what stuck out to you there?
Yeah, so I think relative to SPY, which is sort of the proxy for the S&P 500, we saw underperformance in consumer discretionary that was hurt by QQQ's overweight to Tesla, down 4% last week. And tech was actually hurt by an overweight to Palo Alto Networks. It was down 23% for the week after it lowered its revenue guidance for the year. Healthcare was the biggest contributor to relative performance against the SPY on the positive side, really led by Moderna. So they reported Q4 earnings on February 22nd before the market opened, reported an unexpected profit of 55 cents a share. Estimates was for a loss of over $1 a share. And revenue of 2.8 billion beat the estimate of 2.5 billion by over 12%. So we saw shares rallying by 13.5% in the session following the announcement.
All right. And finally, Ryan, let's take a look at the year-over-year revenue growth for NVIDIA. I mean, you don't have to say anything. The chart speaks for itself.
No, you really don't. I mean, I will anyway. I think when we look at the earnings report, right, revenue of 22.1 billion beat street expectations for 20.4 billion. That's 8.3% roughly upside. That's over 3.5 times the amount in the same quarter 1 year before. You look at comparable EPS of $5.16 versus an estimate of $4.60. That's about a 12% surprise, and nearly 6 times the amount in the same period 1 year earlier. Plus, revenue guidance came in at the midpoint of 24 billion, plus or minus 2%. Street expectations were for just under 22 billion. And then they said the gross margin is going to be a pretty staggering 76.3 to 77%. So now we look at the chart, right? This shows 1 year revenue growth on a quarterly basis over the course of NVIDIA's publicly traded history, right? Since its IPO back in January of 1999. Over the past few quarters, we're looking at the highest growth pretty much in any period of its history. And it's standing at 265% on a year-over-year basis. It's sort of hard to believe that in calendar Q3, calendar Q4 2022, And then calendar Q1 of 2023, revenue growth was negative. Right. So we kind of talked about this, especially with some of the mega cap names. We saw, obviously 2022 being a really hard year, but early on in 2023, we sort of saw an inflection point when it came to revenue growth and EPS reacceleration, sort of like what we saw in 2021. But I think, you look at the movement in the past handful of quarters, right, pretty much since Q2 2023, and it shows just how quickly the demand for chips to power AI applications has ramped up. So, pretty interesting and to see this level of growth at revenue and earnings numbers that are larger than any other period in its history. I think just one other thing to note would be another notable semiconductor announcement is coming up in about a week and a half with Broadcom. Happens to be QQQ and Nasdaq-100's largest kind of overweight relative to the S&P 500 index. So that's coming up on March 7th. So we'll be tuned in for that.
We certainly will, Ryan. Appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.